Hello and welcome back to the channel and the city of Carcassonne. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how people and places live and grow. Today we're visiting Carcassonne in southern France, famous for its stunning medieval architecture and its well-preserved walls, as well as the medieval lower town and access to the Canal du Midi. So walk with me, the armchair traveler, to explore the city and learn how I got that way. Afterwards, be sure to check the description box below for links to learn more. I made this a day trip from Narbonne, and it was a very long day trip. My visit here included 3 activities. I hadn't even made it past the train station when I found these pretty spring flowers to photograph. My first activity of the day was to go for a short sail along the Canal du Midi. There's a link to that trip in the description box below. Next up was the Cité, which I'll call the fortress, developed on the site of a Celtic settlement dating from the 5th century BCE, which then became a Roman fortification and was strengthened in the Middle Ages. The fortress sits on the far side of the river and pretty far uphill. My final stop was in the lower or medieval city, which started out as a Roman-era suburb and is now the main part of the town. I've marked the major stops for you on this map. This Google Earth map shows you the lay of the land. Today, as in the days of the Roman legionaries who camped in the fortress, the city was divided by the Oud River, which I've marked with arrow number 1. The area called the fortress sits on a substantial hill. That's arrow number 2. After a time, the local people and retired legionaries realized that the hill wasn't so handy for doing business or living in, so they settled in what they called a vicus, or a hamlet, which is now marked with arrow 3. Opinions vary somewhat as to the extent of the area and how much it was fortified, but you can think of it as a suburb that outgrew the city. This is the largest and best preserved medieval fortress in Europe and shows us how castle defenses evolved from the days of Roman occupation all the way through the Middle Ages. The area around Carcassonne, today called the medieval city, sits on a plateau about 130 feet or so above sea level. The fortress, as you can see in this image, sits on a much higher hill. The Oud River separated the fortress from the nearby vicus. Pont Vieux, or Old Bridge, connects the medieval city with the castle area. This bridge was part of a Roman road that went across the Oud River, leads you uphill eventually to the main gate of the fortress, then called the Oud Gate. For centuries, this was the only bridge connecting the lower town of Carcassonne with the fortress. During the medieval period, and even today, any invader would have to get past the Roman lower city, across the river, and then up that hill. Once up that hill, if they made it up the hill, they had to contend with a great deal of defensive architecture, as we'll see in just a moment. I mentioned that the river was part of the fortress's natural defenses, as was this hill, which is sometimes referred to as a rampart. I took the left view of the fortress from downhill and from quite a distance, and the right view from somewhat closer up, but still pretty far down that hill. It gives you an idea of just how formidable the riverside approach would have been. In the 12th century, the ruling family began construction of a palace, shown here. They were so sure that the hill would stop any invader that they literally built the palace into the Roman-era walls. This is the western or Oud Gate that I mentioned. It's currently closed to tourists since the area is being renovated and conserved, but long ago this was the main entryway into the fortress. As you can see, it would have been physically challenging for most visitors, even today, even those of us with good knees and balance, and would have been impossible for groups. Tourists today enter on the other side of the facility, the Narbonne Gate, which we'll visit in a few minutes. The fortress is famous for these double walls, which were built in 2 long stages. This map shows the route that the little train takes and runs you around the outside of the wall. The aerial photo here shows you the arrangement of the 2 walls. The inner walls date from late Roman occupation. The outer walls date from after the fall of the city during the Albigensian Crusade. Roman legions built what's now called the inner wall in the 3rd and 4th century CE, possibly replacing earlier walls on the same site. The walls are constructed using opus vitadum, a technique that involved regular layers of stone blocks interspersed with brick or tile bands. The Roman walls were lower and thicker than the later medieval walls. They stood 40 to 60 feet high, but seem even taller because they're so much higher up on the slope. That was more than enough to deter attackers of the age, but they're actually less imposing in some ways than the later 13th century outer walls, which stood between 66 and 90 feet high, but seem shorter in this image, again because of the slope. The outer or curtain wall features towers that were added in the 12th and 13th century. They were round, unroofed, and open back. The towers represent the pinnacle of medieval military engineering and show how defensive architecture adapted to new challenges, such as improved siege tactics and weaponry. Viewed from the inside, you can see how they were designed to work. Assuming an enemy could make it up the slope and could climb up that outer wall, he would be confronted by defenders holed up in the inner wall. The natural tendency would be for an enemy to seize those round towers and try to defend them. It proved to be impossible. They were left completely open to the defenders and their weapons. You can learn a great deal about the evolution of this fortress just by looking at this small area in and around what's now referred to as the Ducal Chateau. This view shows you the Ducal Chateau and the walls around it. The area was originally called the Palatium, or Palace, and it shows us changes in architecture from the days of the Roman legionaries all the way through the 19th century. The square tower and nearby buildings were built by the Trencavel family, the dukes of this area, around 1130. The Trencavels were extremely powerful nobles in the south of France and held this area as viscounty. They transformed the original Gallo-Roman rampart and walls into a fortified residence, which they called the Palatium. This became the symbol of their ducal power. The building was designed not just to protect, but to impress. They typically have a central courtyard, a common feature in medieval castles. The open space let in light, air, and allowed people to move around inside the complex, often with access to other rooms, including living quarters, a great hall or meeting room, a chapel, and administrative offices. It wasn't comfortable as we would define the word, but for its time it was impressive and luxurious. The Trencavels repurposed the flat-top Roman-era walls and towers as the basis for their building. They were so sure that this area would be defended mostly by the hill that they did not imagine they needed any more defenses. The flat-top square tower you see here is called the Tour Pinte, which means something like painted tower, although I think that what they're really talking about is decorations rather than something as ephemeral as whitewash. This is the tallest tower in the Palatium. The tower had crenellations, those tooth-like projections you see at the top, which allowed watchmen or defenders to see out for a great distance without being exposed to enemy threat. These came into vogue in the Middle Ages. Eventually, during the Albigensian Crusade, the fortress fell into the hands of the French. They strengthened it significantly, adding an outer wall, complete with crenellations, which were typical of the period. The crenellations you see on the Roman-era wall and the pepperpot roofs on some of the towers were added by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Remember his name. Think about the defenses and assume that an invader got past the river, up the hill. He had to get past a moat. Dry moats were a common architectural feature in the Middle Ages. Carcassonne sits on top of a hilltop, so it would have been impossible to maintain a wet moat because there's no natural water source necessary to keep it filled. Even without water, however, these moats were still highly effective as defensive features. They created a deep, wide barrier that prevented siege engines from getting too close to the walls and forced the attackers to climb into a vulnerable position before they could scale their wall. It was a dry moat and kept clear of things like shade trees today, as it would have been in the Middle Ages. The French did a great deal more than just add walls. They built what is now the main or Narbonne gate to the city. This was built in the 13th century during the reign of King Louis IX and his successor Philip III, and served as the main defensive entrance to the fortress. It's named after the nearby city of Narbonne, as the gate faces in its general direction. The gate includes two massive round towers connected by a central archway and was originally equipped with a portcullis and probably other defensive mechanisms. It was an imposing structure designed to make potential attackers think twice. It offers a dramatic introduction to the city's medieval ambience and its massive stone walls and well-preserved fortifications. But the 19th century restorers saw fit to glam it up with a drawbridge just visible in these photos. That wasn't there originally. The area here in and around the fortress has been known and occupied since at least the 5th century BCE, so we have a pretty good idea of how it evolved over time. Evolution isn't very romantic. Groups of people, whether modern families or earlier tribes and locations, always have some kind of origin story. Sometimes the story is based in fact, other times it's simply made up. Carcassonne is no exception. The story here goes that in the 8th century, Carcassonne was under Saracen control. That part was true. Charlemagne's forces, who were opposed to the Saracens, may have actually besieged the city. It's always been a military stronghold commanding the old Roman trade routes and the river. There's no evidence, however, that Charlemagne himself ever got close to this area. Lady Carcasonne was a Saracen princess who is said to have orchestrated the city's defense against Charlemagne's forces. She ordered her soldiers to throw the last remaining grain and food over the walls, making it appear as though the city still had plenty of resources, when in fact the people inside were starving. The enemy, believing that they could not win the siege, gave up and withdrew. Lady Carcasonne, celebrating the victory, is said to have opened the gates of the city and called out Carcassonne, which means Carcass sings, as the city bells were rung to signal the success. This monument, located just outside the Narbonne Gate, features an image of the lady and commemorates the tale. It was placed here in 1901. Once inside the gate, you'll be confronted not with the rectilinear and nifty street plan which the Romans would have favored, but a medieval rabbit's warren of streets. The fortress has always been a defensive structure, but from the days of the Celts to today, few people actually live here. Today, they number perhaps a couple of dozen, mostly people who work in the busy hospitality industry inside the fortress. This view is of one of the main streets. Notice the sign on the left with the arrow. It warns walkers that some serious climbing was in their future. Religion was a central point and mainstay of medieval life. The Basilica of Saints Nazarius and Celsus is a minor Roman Catholic basilica here inside the fortress. The original church was built in the 6th century, but was later rebuilt and consecrated in 1096 by Pope Urban II during a visit here to the city. The church was initially designed in Romanesque style with thick walls, round arches, and small windows, which you can see in this image. Some of that Romanesque style remains obvious even in the interior. During the 13th and 14th century, parts of the church were extensively remodeled in Gothic style under the patronage of the Trencavel family, who we met earlier. This remodeling added Gothic elements, including large stained glass windows and intricate stone carvings. The story of the Albigensian Crusade, the fall of the fortress, and the destruction of the Trencavel family is far too long to include here, but let me give you the gist of it. The fortress defenses we've already seen, the location on a high hill, the tall Roman-era walls, and a violent determination that their side of a religious view was correct were not enough to save the defense from the forces of the Albigensian Crusade, which began in 1206. Raymond Roger Trencavel led the defense. Crusaders, led by Simon de Montfort, led the opposition. Their plan was to exterminate the Cathar threat to the Catholic faith. They laid siege to the fortress, cutting off food and water supplies. We already know there weren't any wells or an aqueduct up in the fortress, and the defenders apparently were not ready for the siege. With no secure water supply and inadequate food, within 2 weeks they were starving and ill. Raymond Roger negotiated a surrender to Simon de Montfort on condition that neither he nor his followers would face execution or further harm, and would be allowed to leave the city. He surrendered the fortress in good faith. De Montfort, however, did not keep his end of the deal. He had Raymond Roger locked up and probably left to starve to death. The exact details of his fate are unclear, but we believe he died in May 1209, only a few months after the fall of the fortress itself. Many of the defenders and civilians living in the city were executed by being burnt at the stake, or were exiled and displaced, or forced to repent their beliefs in public. I always assume, until proven otherwise, that religious beliefs are deeply held and sincere. Sure, there are a few hypocrites out there, but most people believe what they believe. If they thought their beliefs were true, to save themselves, they would be forced to reject the religion. That might have been a fate worse than death in some respects, because although they would have lived on for a while here on Earth, an eternity of pain awaited them when they finally died. Let's meet the 3 men responsible for rescuing the fortress. The French government, which had seized the fortress during the Albigensian Crusade and maintained it for centuries, saw eventually that its military usefulness had declined, and maintenance costs increased. Napoleon Bonaparte ordered the partial destruction of the fortress, in part because it was already falling down, although the work was never carried out as planned. He didn't think the area was needed for defense, and I suppose he was right. He also wanted to save money by not maintaining it any longer. Fast forward a few years, and 3 Frenchmen get the award as saviors of the fortress. The first to make a stink about this area was the then mayor of the city, a man named Jean-Pierre Cros-Maravilla. He was a mayor, a historian, and what we'd call a 19th century monuments man. Jean-Pierre saw this as a monument to the history of the region and objected to the demolition. He managed to enlist the support of a man significantly more important in French government and history named Prosper Mérimée. Mérimée was an author and one of the pioneers of a short story form called a novella. He's perhaps best known for penning the novella Carmen, which became the basis of Bizet's famous opera. He was also an archaeologist and a historian, and an important figure in the history of architectural preservation. Finally, between 1830 and 1860, he was the inspector of French historical monuments and responsible for the protection of many historical sites. Mérimée, like Jean-Pierre, thought the site was worth saving. Mérimée hired Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, a French architect and also an author. Viollet-le-Duc was already famous for restoring and preserving other prominent medieval landmarks in France, including Notre Dame de Paris. The condition of the site varied widely. The fortifications themselves seemed to be mostly intact, since the walls surrounding the city were still a military defensive zone as late as the 19th century. But the towers didn't have tops, and a large number of lean-to structures had been built up against those old walls. Viollet-le-Duc began by demolishing all those lean-to structures and restored the gates, the walls, and the towers to their original form. He also made what we in the 21st century would call a blunder. Viollet-le-Duc was a student of Gothic architecture, and specifically Northern Gothic architecture. He really didn't know what some parts of the project, for example, the Roman walls or the roofs or the towers, might have looked like in their day. So he added on bits and pieces that he thought were correct, or at a minimum would make the place seem more attractive. And he was wrong about it. This would never be done under today's UNESCO World Heritage Guidelines. I'd argue the damage from the incorrect details he added are more than outweighed by the fact that he saved the walls completely. With the story of the gruesome fall of the ducal family and the salvation of the fortress, it's probably time for us to push on to the lower or medieval city of Carcassonne. The fortress itself was quite small, so the action, private, civil, business, trade, was mostly down here where there was more space, a more reliable water supply, and access to the river and roads. The Roman Imperial Road, which was part of the Via Domitia, likely passed through the center of the lower city. Like all Roman habitations, the lower city was built according to a plan and had some limited defenses. The lower town was located near the river, which provided a natural defense on one side. Archaeological evidence tells us that the Roman settlement included some structures and defenses like earthworks, but it was not nearly as strongly fortified as the upper town. Perhaps the Romans didn't think it was necessary. Those defenses proved inadequate, however, in the long run. In 1355, during the Hundred Years' War, the lower town was seized, captured, and burnt to the ground by the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, the son of King Edward III of England. His military campaigns were part of a broader conflict between England and France, and Carcassonne was an important strategic location that the English wanted to possess. His forces either weren't able or willing to capture the fortress, or perhaps just chose to skip it and went on to where the pickings were easier, here in the lower medieval city. They believed that damaging the lower town would cripple the area's ability to resist English control, and they were probably right. In the Roman era, the forum was likely situated in an area which was called Place Carnot. Today, as in the time of the legionaries, this pretty square was an important commercial and social hub. There's a lovely statue of Neptune here in the center. The lower city leads us back to the train station and to the end of our visit. Come back next time for a new adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France. Not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser-known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on-the-ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up. Other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog. a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.